So it's now my great pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Professor Rick Banks, who will be chairing our third and final panel. Rick is the Jackson Eli Reynolds Professor of Law at Stanford Law School and Professor by courtesy at the School of Education. He teaches and writes about family law, employment discrimination law, race in the law. His 2011 book is Marriage for White People, How the African-American Marriage Decline Affects Everyone, was selected by the Wilson Quarterly as one of the top 10 books of the year. He's the co-author of a path-breaking textbook on racial justice in the law released just last year. He's a recognized, nationally recognized expert on race in the law. He's written powerfully about an astonishingly wide range of topics within that broad category. For me personally, it's quite impressive to me that although he doesn't teach criminal law or criminal procedure, he's written some of the sharpest and most thoughtful scholarship I've read on the problem of racial profiling. And I promised him I'd keep it short, so I'm just going to say he's also one of the best colleagues you could possibly imagine. And take it away.
Okay, thank you. As my wife says, when you ask a law professor to keep it short, you need to know that it has a different meaning. Can everyone hear me? This should be on the mic. So I'll put this down here. Okay, so I'm pleased to be here. Happy to see all of you here. I'm even happier that this event is occurring. This is a timely event that engages a crucially important set of issues. These are issues, we should be clear, that really implicate the deepest challenges to our democracy. These are issues that implicate the health of our nation, not only now, but for many years to come. So let me tell you just a little bit about how the panel will operate. I'm aware that this is the last panel of the day. So what we would like to do is, after I introduce the panelists, I'll give them a few questions, and we'll kind of mix it up here, and then we'll open it up to have more discussion, interaction, disagreement, engagement from you all. Right? And so if you have questions that are brewing as we're talking, I'll give you the cue when to. You can go and line up at either of the mics, and then we'll just alternate from one mic to the other. Okay, so I'm honored to be among all of you. At the end of the row here, we have Paul Butler, who's a professor of law at Georgetown, and has been a friend of mine for many years. Even before I went to law school, I first became acquainted with Paul before I even went to law school, and he was part of the inspiration, actually, that made me see that law professors could say things that were both intellectually serious, that they were passionate about, and which were also socially important. So that was back in the early 90s. And Paul teaches at Georgetown. His forthcoming book I happen to have a copy of, Chokehold, right here, a former prosecutor's radical thoughts on how to disrupt the system. And this is about the policing of black men. And that will be out in June. Okay. Coming toward me, we next have Nikki Jones, PhD. Professor Jones is Associate Professor of African American Studies at UC Berkeley. Her research centers on violence and policing in African American communities, as well as racial and gender disparities in the criminal justice system. She's an ethnographer who published the book Between Good and Ghetto, African American Girls and Inner City Violence, that focused on girls in Philadelphia. She also has current work rooted in San Francisco that looks at how disadvantaged men work together to change their lives and communities. And closest to me, we have Professor Howard Pinderhughes, who's an associate professor of social and behavioral sciences at UCSF. His research focuses on trauma-informed approaches to reducing violence and on understanding how law enforcement strategies may contribute or exacerbate instability in disadvantaged communities. His book, relevant to this, is Dealing with Trauma, which is a Bay Area-focused inquiry on how youth manage the threat of violence in their communities. He's also worked with cities around the country, including some that we'll discuss during this panel, on how to reduce violence in their communities. So let's move on to the discussion. So first, issue I want to raise is, being a law professor, I can't help but think about equal justice under law. Even if you're not a law professor, you've heard the phrase equal justice under law, a fundamental precept, a foundational principle of our society. Yet, events over the last few years remind us that the principle of equal justice under law is in some sense more aspiration than reality. That the breaches or the failures to realize that principle may overshadow our fulfillment of it. So I'd like the panelists first to discuss, and this is for all of you, starting with Paul and then Howard and then Nikki, to discuss what is the evidence that we fail to live up to or realize the ideal of equal justice under law. So Paul and then Howard and then Nikki.
So the evidence includes the reports that the Department of Justice did in Ferguson, in Baltimore, in Chicago. Every time the department looks at policing and race, it finds that the police harass African Americans as policy. It's their official practice to disproportionately shoot us, beat us up, stop and frisk us, curse at us, and lay hands on us. Every time that the Ferguson Police Department used a dog, they used it against an African American. This was not because there weren't white dudes in Ferguson who got drunk and resisted arrest. It was because the purpose of those dogs was to communicate to us, African Americans, that our citizenship is degraded. So it's wrong to think of the problem as bad apple cops. The problem is the nature of police work. The system is working the way it's supposed to. The system is broke on purpose. So the police have superpowers that the Supreme Court has blessed them with the understanding that those powers are to be used against Latino and African American men. So if you look at cases like Scott versus Harris, the Atlanta police are chasing this young black man for speeding. He should have stopped, but he doesn't. He keeps going. Police can't catch him, so what they do is to ram his car down a ravine on purpose. Fortunately, he survives, but the car bursts into flames. He's rendered a quadriplegic. The question that made it to the court was, can the police use deadly force to apprehend someone for the crime of speeding, even if he's evading arrest? I mean, after all, they had his license plate. They could ID him. The court said that that was perfectly constitutional to do that. We could talk about Mrs. Atwater, who was arrested in Texas because she wasn't wearing a seatbelt. And she thought it was kind of weird that she could get arrested for that crime because in Texas, even if you're guilty of it, you can't go to prison. The maximum fine is $50. Court says you can arrest somebody for anything. We can talk about Wren, in which in the District of Columbia, the DC police stopped a young man for a number of traffic infractions, including waiting too long at a stop sign. They really wanted to stop him because they wanted to see what they could see. And he went to the court saying, if the police don't have a really good reason for stopping you, they shouldn't be allowed to use some kind of pretext. The court said, that's not a problem. As long as they have any reason, they can stop you. It's got to be an objective reason. So the way that translates to my classroom is my buddy who's a cop. It takes my students on a ride along, and he plays a game with them he calls pick a car, which means that the student points to any car on the road and the cop stops it. He's a good cop. He waits till he finds a legal reason. It doesn't take long, more than 3 or 4 blocks. Any car is going to commit an infraction. And then this cop can order the driver and the passenger to get out if he suspects that they might be dangerous. He can put his hands all over their bodies. Love this symposium so far and just really enthralled with this idea of this public health system and this criminal justice system. I'm not sure how far to take the analogy, because in some ways the criminal justice system itself is the disease. Policing is the disease. I don't know if there's a way that we can police in the United States that isn't all about race, that's not all about class. And I haven't seen any evidence of that so far.
Howard, do you want me to, am I on too? You want me to answer the question, what's the evidence?
Yeah, what's the evidence?
Are you serious?
That was the question we agreed on.
I'm just asking, because I'm not going to talk about the evidence, because we all know what the evidence is, right?
We got a lot of people here.
I got that, but let's be real. Let's be real. We all know the evidence, correct? And so the question is not what's the evidence. The question is, how is that evidence interpreted, analyzed, and what are the policies that are put in place based on those analyses? Because earlier data was brought up, right? And there was that was the answer to why there wasn't a community narrative here. And I'm going to take a little issue with that, because community narratives are data from my perspective. First of all, I grew up in Roxbury in Boston. And my first experience with this issue came as a result of being an African-American boy, then young man, growing up in Boston and encountering the police on a regular basis. Fast forward to New York City, where I did my doctoral research in East Harlem at Schaumburg Plaza. Now, that may not mean anything for all of y'all, but 3 of the 4 kids who were convicted of the Central Park jogger case lived in Schaumburg Plaza. I had 2 of them, Kevin Richardson and Yusef Salam, in my groups. And I was 100% sure that Yusef Salam had not done it. Kevin, some of the kids said, well, he was he was out there. He could have done it. But we all know what the story is. But the part of this story that I want to tell you about was every single one of the young people that I interviewed in East Harlem, and that was 55 of them, every single one of them had been stopped by the police at least once, put in a police car, driven, threatened with the death penalty. They didn't even have the death penalty in New York City at the time, as a way to investigate the crime. Now, these are the kinds of experiences that young black and brown, particularly males, but increasingly females, have. Those aren't part of the statistics. That's not part of the evidence. And so it doesn't become part of the data, but it certainly becomes part of the experience, the narrative, the understanding, and the reality of people living in highly impacted, violent communities. And so that's why I asked that question about evidence, because we've got to start moving away from just that type of evidence. The second thing I'll say, and I wasn't here in the morning, but part of what I want, my work focuses at a community level. And a lot of the conversation that we have is at an individual level, and that's problematic. Part of the reason that it's problematic is that that is a criminal justice paradigm and frame. Okay? We take it one person and issue an incident at a time, rather than understanding a community and what happens within a community, at a community level, as well as at an individual level. Now, in terms of violence, we've come to the understanding, and this is major, major steps forward, of the role of trauma, the impact of trauma, the depth and effects of trauma on young people, children in highly impacted and violent communities. And that's a huge step forward. We've got trauma-informed care at the public health level in the health community. We've got trauma-informed pedagogy at some schools. We're starting even to have trauma-informed practices in some juvenile justice facilities. And what I'm telling you is that we've got to move to that next level of understanding the trauma that communities experience. And what do I mean by that? Community trauma exists, and you can go to any highly impacted neighborhood and they'll tell you, yes, we're traumatized. But what most people think about when they talk about community trauma is individual trauma, that we have a whole bunch of folk who are traumatized. And that's true. But community trauma is not just the aggregate of individuals who have trauma. There are elements of communities that are traumatized. Those are those institutions that Victor was talking about earlier, and the impact that those institutions have. So it's the impact at a community level on social relations, social networks, and social norms, the impact on the built environment, and the impact on the educational and economic structure of opportunities. All of those are impacted by structural violence that has been in place in this society and nation for centuries. And the result is what we have in Roxbury and in East Oakland and in Watts. And we can all name the different neighborhoods where the violence occurs. Understanding that piece and the role that policing and police practice and police and criminal justice institutions play in structural violence. That's, I think, one of the things that we have to take into account, because that structural violence is part of what impacts individual trauma as well as the community trauma that we can talk about. But I'll leave it at that, and we can talk more about it as we get in.
That was a great opening statement, please.
Yeah. What is there to add? But I'll build on this this point here about the violence as evidence. And then what is it evidence of? Well, it may be for some evidence of a need to deploy assets. And when you think about the kind of dominant frameworks in policing, the hotspot policing, the proactive policing, you target resource to where the problem is. But that kind of definition doesn't imagine that the violence is a manifestation of structural violence. That it's a violence that's moving through people's bodies and minds, that it's doing a trauma to the individual. So in a lot of my work, I analyze video recordings of police-civilian encounters, including recordings that were taken by a neighborhood videographer who for years and years and years recorded police encounters that occurred in his neighborhood. And one of the things that you see when you look at that corpus is that young people are on the outskirts of the encounter, right? 7, 8, 9-year-old. They move, right, to the targets of the encounter a few years later by the time they enter their teens. And a little later into adolescence, some of them, at least in the corpus that I have, some of those young people are dead. Right? So it's actually a contradiction. One that a young person mentioned earlier is that the police are always there, omnipresent, but the violence continues. It's a contradiction. Young people are targets of police violence, aggressive, intrusive encounters. Right? And they're also the targets of violence from other young people who are as alienated and isolated as they are. And so in my work, I see the violence itself as a manifestation as evidence of the problem, as evidence of a history of structural racism that has isolated communities, certain communities of color, from mainstream civic life over centuries. And it's not a violence that just stays in one's body. It's not a trauma that just stays in one person's body. I write that it's a trauma, it's a violence that sends ripple effects of aggression outward onto the community. Now, as I'm trained as an ethnographer, so I'll give you one example. I was doing field work in a neighborhood in San Francisco, Fillmore neighborhood. Neighborhood I describe as a high surveillance neighborhood, right? So it's the flip of the hotspot neighborhood, because what it feels like to people in the neighborhood is high surveillance, right? Also feels like a hotspot in some ways, but it's a high surveillance neighborhood. And I was working with a group of guys who used to be hustlers, dealers, and addicts, and now we're trying to turn their lives around. And one of the ways that they did this, as people all over the country do in communities like this, is they want to work with young people. And so we're at a meeting led by one guy, Lincoln, right? And it's a good reputation in the neighborhood, has a street reputation, but also a reputation increasingly as a volunteer in the neighborhood. He gets this boys group together every week, talks to them about their lives, mentors them. And this particular evening, he's helping them process their feelings about an aggressive police encounter that they observed in their neighborhood. All right? And so apparently there was a call that someone had a gun, description, black man, white t-shirt, right, which is broad enough to fit everybody in the room at that time. And so the police arrive on the scene. They handle this man roughly, throw him in the back of the police car. What everyone in the neighborhood knew was that they got the wrong guy. Right? So not only did they get the wrong guy, they treated this guy who had some respect, right, in the neighborhood as a decent guy in the neighborhood really roughly. And so we're talking to young people about this, 12, 13 years old, about this. How does this make you feel? It makes me feel like I don't have any power. How does it make you feel about the police? It makes me feel like I want to hurt the police. Well, you can't hurt the police. What can you do? I don't know. Do well in school, stay out of trouble. Right? And I pressed them again. What else can you do? And there's silence. Right? A sense of powerlessness. And so I'm leaving that meeting. I'm the only woman in the room, a group of young men, and I have to leave. And so I say my goodbyes to the group. And as I'm leaving the group's still silent. And my hand hits the door, and I'm about to step out. And there's this one young man who always treated me with deference and respect. And as I'm leaving the room, into the silence, he says, "Bye, sexy. Bye, sexy." Right? Grown woman, right? Teenage boy. And what's that about, right? Our initial reaction might be to target that young man. And certainly Lincoln was going to give him some say-so about doing that, right? But I didn't see the violence as originating in him. I saw the violence as originating, the treatment that came from him originating in his observation of that aggressive police encounter. So that aggressive encounter, right, the aggression, the violence that's rooted in that, somehow found its way to my body through that young man. And so when I think about the evidence of injustice and differential treatment and the history of that over time, I look at the violence, not only the neighborhood violence, but also violence against black women and girls in communities like the Fillmore, right, in black communities across the country. So I do think about, someone raised the point about domestic violence and intimate violence. I see those as failures as well. We tend to, and historically, we have rooted those explanations for that violence in the bodies and minds of black people. But I encourage us to reframe that, right? And then when we do that, understand that the violence that we say legitimizes the police presence, right, is actually a manifestation of a larger problem. I'll stop there.
Okay. Okay, this is going to get interesting here. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. I know, Paul, this one will certainly be pitched to you, but you all can jump in as well. So we have these problems and this cycle of violence, and we have law enforcement officers and other state actors who are ostensibly embodiments of justice, ostensibly, but can also be agents of violence. Why do these problems persist with so much impunity and so little accountability? So, Paul.
So if the system is working the way it's supposed to, reform is kind of an incoherent concept, right? So the reason that police officers don't get put in prison for putting Eric Garner in a chokehold is because they are acting legally. What we saw in that violent video from Victor of a child, a kid in high school being tackled by a police officer, that's what you call a good day at the office. So if the system's not broke, then it can't be fixed. It's not supposed to be fixed. There's nothing to fix. So let's think about things that are supposed to make a difference. So we can think about procedural justice. We heard about that earlier today, this idea that there needs to be more legitimacy, that citizens need to respect the process more. So there actually are ways to make that happen, but I think we have to be thoughtful about what that means. So one of the dumb things that the New York Police Department did in its stop and frisk program was the way that they operated the program. So you could be going to visit your mom in projects, and you go through the front door to the apartment building. You don't ring the buzzer because the buzzer's broken. You don't use a key because the lock is busted. When you get inside, there's 4 members of the NYPD waiting for you. And they say, "Get over here." What did I do? Trespass. I'm going to visit my mom. Put your hands against the wall. Why? I'm going to see my mom. Put your hands against the motherfucking wall. You've seen me here before, cop. You know my mom lives on the Then they kick your feet apart. Then they put their hands all over your body. They take out your asthma inhaler. They say, "What's this?" You say, "It's my asthma inhaler." They show it to somebody. He says, "Yeah, that's what it is." And then they leave you. So here's the thing. This is how procedural justice works. You walk inside the building, and they say, "Mr. Jones, we hate to do this, but there's been a problem here in the building with guns." And you say, "I'm just going to visit my mom." And so they say, we just want to keep your mom safe. And we know that you're not carrying, but look, the sergeant's over there, and we're just trying to do this as to many people as you can. You know the problem, so if you wouldn't mind, Mr. Jones, we're just going to do this real quick, and then you can go up and see your mom. So Mr. Jones actually feels a lot better about that encounter. The problem is that encounter is still unconstitutional. And Mr. Jones, the problem is that the police are still serving as the government for Latino and African American men all across the country. They're the primary manifestation of the state in their lives. And so we need to be wary about any system, any process that makes people feel better about that. It does not mean that the police should not treat people with respect and dignity. Of course they should. But the bottom line is that the criminal process, the way that Latino and African American people are policed, is not one that we should ever be comfortable with. So even if procedural justice works, in a way we've been took, we've been bamboozled, we've been hoodwinked, we've been pacified. And the other thing, real quickly, just it came up earlier as well, as, well, what about having more people who look like me, more people who look like Victor on the department? I think that's a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient condition. One finding that the Justice Department made in Philadelphia is that if you look like me, if you're an unarmed African American man, a white cop is your best friend. You're most likely to be shot by a Latino officer, followed closely by an African American officer. Now, we don't know exactly why that is. It could be because Black and Latino officers are disproportionately deployed in Black areas, or it could be that we're quicker in the draw. But the bottom line is just making police departments more diverse. It's important, but it's also not going to solve the problem.
Okay, so let me just let people know, if you have questions, you can go to either mic, and then after this round of discussion, we'll open it up to broader discussion. So just to sort of reframe the issue a little bit, you all have described the problem and the cycle. How and where should we intervene, right, if we do want to make things better?
So I should say that in addition to the analysis of video recordings that I've done in the neighborhood, I've also collaborated with law enforcement to collect dash cam video and to conduct video recorded ride-alongs in one city, all 10 districts in a housing complex. And we systematically analyze these encounters with an eye toward how can officers de-escalate conflict and build trust during the course of the encounter, understanding all the limitations of that, but still wanting, perhaps naively, to contribute to the conversation. And so when people ask me what I think ought to be done, I think we need to reduce the frequency of encounters in high surveillance neighborhoods. We've kind of justified the logic, and there's a narrative that supports that this is where crime and violence is happening. But the range of encounters that occur, I think for most people it would be baffling. For me, with all of my education and training going into this neighborhood and realizing the range of ways that young people interacted with adult officers with no intermediaries, no buffers, right, no protection. And we know about the adolescent development and the adolescent brain and the ability to understand these encounters. And these young people are developing, right, official contacts with the police at a very young age. And Victor has written about this as well. They're getting entered into gang databases, right? They're getting known in a way that's consequential for how they'll be treated in the future. And some of these official records are just generated from what would be described as consensual encounters. Can I talk to you for a moment, right? And so I think that we really need to think about the frequency of encounters. We have conditioned young people in these neighborhoods in a way that other young people in middle-class settings simply aren't conditioned. So there's a clip in the neighborhood of a young man who's going through a search with no verbal direction at all from the officer. They're talking about something else the whole time, right? So the young person is not being told what to do, how to move his body, whether or not to. Right? You only get that if you've had a number of those kinds of encounters, right, over time. And so, and through that, you are developing a much different relationship to authority, right, than people in other more stable settings. Your world is getting smaller, right? So we know about adolescent development. Our worlds are supposed to get bigger, right? But as young people in these neighborhoods move through adolescence, their worlds get smaller. They get what one respondent described as they get locked on the block, right? Small world. So I think we need to reduce the frequency of encounters when they do occur. I think we do need to improve the quality of encounters. What Victor was saying about dignity, I think, is deeply important. There's a good deal of sociological evidence on the importance of that, right? And so I think we ought to improve the equality. And then accountability. And I say it 3 times, right? Accountability, at the interactional level, right? And face-to-face interaction, but also institutionally. And the panel earlier talked about some of the challenges around holding institutions accountable, holding police accountable. And I think we need to continue to put pressure on that because it is the thing, particularly that Black communities have continued to fight for, right? Even with the experience of alienation and isolation. Right? And the many reasons why we ought to perhaps not believe in this system. Again and again, we fight for the expansion of these rights. Right? And so I think that we need to continue to push institutions to be accountable in that way.
And Howard, what would it, you talked earlier about the need for trauma-informed practices and the recognition that trauma is a community phenomenon, not simply an individual phenomenon. Could you say a little bit more about what that would look like, what you would see as the most promising?
That's good. That's really good.
Type of interventions? Okay.
Good question.
Okay.
No, the reason
you just wait on the next one. This is the setup question. I'm gonna get you on the next one.
The reason I say that is because I've worked with cities across the country, including LA, Chicago, Boston, Minneapolis, Seattle, New Orleans, Baltimore, a range of different on comprehensive violence prevention plans implementation. And at each of those, we've got public health at the table, we've got law enforcement at the table, we have as many social services, all of everybody who you need at the table. And part of the issue becomes how you shift the power and the focus from a criminal justice driven process and policy and practice to one that's a public health policy and practice moving forward. Now, and I want to talk to you, Victor, about how this is working because I've talked with some folks in the Watts precinct. And I've talked with in a couple of precincts in Minneapolis and a couple of and one in Seattle, where part of what community policing has become is moving to the level of acknowledging the role that the police department have had in the oppression of a community. Engaging the historical trauma of a community, which can go a long way towards shifting that relationship. Because part of the issue is that, and I've seen it over and over and over again. I was in Milwaukee in January, and we had our second meeting of the collaborative, and we were coming up with the principles for developing the comprehensive violence prevention plan. And one of them, which was put forward by the community, was an understanding that institutions have been racist in their practice and have enacted trauma on the community. The police chief basically walked out of that meeting. Not before he launched into a very, very involved defense of the police department. Now, I understand that. That's his role in a public space, is to defend his department and his people. And so folks on each side of that collaborative have to understand language and engage and be able to do that. But part of the point is that I've seen it over and over again that police departments are unable to acknowledge the role they've played in inflicting trauma on communities. And believe me, they have inflicted trauma on communities. And that's not, and I want to make sure, particularly with former police chief in the room, this is not to say we don't want police. Everybody needs police, wants police. That's a universal. But part of the issue is that we have a tendency to have this kind of binary understanding of what's going on in communities. And you have the good folk and the thugs. And we just have to deal with the thugs. And that's very much kind of how a criminal justice mentality does. The reality is, when you work with these young people, they're back and forth all the time. They're along that continuum. They're victims, they're so-called perpetrators. And when you talk with community folks who want safety, it's their brother, their uncle, their aunt who are on the street doing the dirt. It's complex and it's not easy, and the binary pieces don't work and they break down, and that's part of the reason why you can't get folks to rat out people. Because everybody knows who's doing what. But first of all, they don't trust the system. That goes back to what you said, Victor. But secondly, it's this issue of historical trauma, of feeling like you get folks involved in the system, that's a black hole that they don't come out of.
And that's why ethnic studies, social justice literacy, and also just overall well-being has to be front and center in police officer training. So, we want to have well-being, resilience, grit for young people, and that's very important. But then we got to turn it around, too, and educate, right, these officers in sort of the ethnic studies and the social justice literacy, because how do you recognize that your force for 100 years, 200 years has actually been part of the system of oppression? Well, you first have to learn about it.
Right. And it's unfair to expect an officer to walk into a community when they don't know what the history of the relationship is and expect that they're going to be able to negotiate the anger, the distrust, the trauma that they're going to encounter in that community. And so that's part of what this acknowledgement and then kind of developing practice that takes into account the historical trauma and the community trauma that's been resulting from, and this is not just from police practice, but also from community practice as well.
And I should say that this is why the work that Professor Pinderhughes is doing, and why I'm so gratified that you are holding this symposium, because I think it's so important for people outside of law enforcement to stake a claim, right, to this topic, to say when it has to do with young people that we care about young people too. And we, in fact, know that these kinds of interactions do not benefit positive adolescent development. We know that, right? And so we need to hold you accountable, right, for behaving in ways that we know promote healthy adolescent development. I think other folks have to be involved in the conversation, and law enforcement has had a kind of legitimacy grip on this problem, and it was constructed, socially constructed, built on a history of racism. We have to understand that, and we have to loosen that grip. And certainly there's an expertise that exists in any profession, right? But it should not be the sole providence of law enforcement to engage, police, discipline young people. Other people need to be involved in that project. And I would say, as I say in some of my other work, we need to be on the side of young people. We need to be advocates for young people. It doesn't mean you have to be opposed always. Sometimes it's useful. But we need to be advocates for young people.
And just because, real quickly, because you said we were going to disagree, and so far we haven't, I will disagree with what Howard said about how everybody in this room wants to have police.
This is my next question, man.
I thought you might.
I don't want to have police. Not because police are bad people. Police are some of the hardest working people I know who do a job that I'm not brave enough to do. At the same time, given what you've said about the history, I think looking at that history, you have to ask, is there any way that they can do their jobs that, again, isn't all about race and class? And I think that history tells us that the answer is no. And so on a beautiful campus like this, I think we have to dream big. I think you guys have to be visionaries. And I think you have to imagine a world without prison. And you have to imagine a world without the people who are the first parts of the process of entering into prison. So what do we want for prison? What do we expect prison to do? We want safety and we want accountability. So we have to ask, are there better ways of delivering those than prison? And the answer has got to be yes, because we know that prison doesn't deliver those. So when you talk about your hood, where people are at risk for violence, the reason that they don't think the police help them is because the police don't help them. And that's in part because we ask the police to do way more than they're able to do. We ask them to deal with all kinds of problems that they're not equipped to deal with through no fault of their own, but because that's where we basically dump young Latino and African American men and expect them to deal with it. So again, on this beautiful campus of all places, please imagine a world without police and prison.
Well, I should have to say, there's another beautiful campus up the road, slightly. And there are folks, including a student, one of my graduate students in the room who's been in my seminars this year, who is thinking about just this thing. So I think that there are folks who are beginning to put their mind to it and imagine what it would be like. When this question, I think, or comment came up a little bit earlier today, one of the things that I think about and thought about was, do I want police or do I not want police? I don't want poverty. The police are called on to police poverty, right? And so thinking, again, about going outside of the police, the institution, as a solution, and being sure to kind of understand our framing of the problem and the kind of sites of intervention we're imagining, right? Because if poverty doesn't exist, what will the police do? Tour guides, give out directions, So
Okay.
people,
No, these are great issues. Let's throw it open, please.
Thank you. My name is Sonu Thadani, and I serve on a campus center called Presence, about the art and science of human connection in medicine. I also serve on the San Mateo County Commission for Juvenile Justice, Delinquency, and Prevention. And I've been a volunteer in that space for over a decade. My question is that in today's day and age, we're not only a nation divided, but we appear to be communities divided. In this space, what is the opportunity for things like restorative justice models or truth and reconciliation commissions to actually explore what it takes for us to build stronger communities? Thank you.
Well, I'm certainly of the opinion if we're going to move in the direction of no police, then we're going to have to come up with a whole bunch of alternative ideas. But the reality is that restorative justice practice is a very, very critical strategy for doing a number of things. One is reducing the number of folks who end up in the criminal justice system. But another has to do with rebuilding some of the elements of community trauma and healing communities. And by that I mean any restorative justice program that I've worked with that is doing really good work, it's intergenerational. And so they're restoring intergenerational social relationships and ties, building in some of that mentorship relationship within the context of it. It's shifting and changing social norms on a number of different levels. It's changing the norms that within a community of how you deal with conflict. Because right now, in a lot of communities, the way we deal with conflict is we settle it, right? And this is actually having people hold themselves accountable to a community and to being able to understand that's an important value. And so that social norms change, the shifting and changing of relationships is every bit as important as the outcome of reconciliation at an individual level, where people start to feel like, okay, I've gotten justice within the context of what happened. But it's also building the possibility and potential for people to relate to each other and work together with each other in community in a way that we don't have it currently in a lot of places.
Please.
Hi, I'm an undergrad student. My name is Esther Milton. I'm studying human biology, and African and African American studies. And my question was around prison abolition, which I appreciate that you touched on. I think on our campus, at least in the communities that I've centered myself around, prison abolition is seen as the next step in terms of talking about ending mass incarceration and violence for minority communities by police. Though I struggle when reaching a broader community in talking about the idea of prison abolition. My father was incarcerated, and when I bring up how I'm studying prison abolition as like a practical solution, he even himself says that, I'm crazy and I'm just, in this utopian mindset. And I'm wondering what you all think, given that we know that there is community trauma and not just individual trauma related to incarceration of an individual, what more do you think is necessary to make the idea of prison abolition not just a radical solution, but something that is actually practical?
So every struggle for racial justice in this country has been an abolition movement. Every struggle, I should correct myself, for black racial justice, for African American racial justice. So if we think about slavery, abolition. If we think about the old Jim Crow, it was abolition, Brown versus Board of Education, where the Supreme Court said separate but equal was unconstitutional. So we need to understand this new movement for Black lives is also requiring abolition. And what does that mean? So again, learning from history, we know that those other movements for abolition, they took years. The movement to end slavery took years. The movement to end the old Jim Crow took years. This movement will take years as well. And my colleague, Allegra McLeod, has written about us understanding it as a practice of gradual decarceration, which means that we don't go and open every prison door tomorrow. What we do is think about, again, what we hope prison will do that we know it doesn't. We hope it will make us safe. It doesn't. We hope it will make people accountable for the wrong they have done. It doesn't. So we imagine other ways that do that more effectively. And there's lots of those projects going on all over the country. If you're interested, for example, Google Common Justice in Brooklyn. They're doing real good work on that front. Also understanding it as a gradual process, the Brennan Center at New York University Law School issued a report in December. This is not a radical group, where they said right now we could let out 40% of the people in prison. And not only will we be in no more danger, we'd actually be safer. And what's that mean? It means because about 25% of people who are there for nonviolent, victimless crimes. So even if they're out, even if they're committing the same crimes, they're not going to make you less safe. Another 10% are people who've done bad things but have been locked up long enough that if they're out now, they're not going to do more bad things. We already heard that violent crime, it's a young man's game. So it's something that you age out of. Conservatively, you age out of it at 30. Some people would say even younger. And the last part of that is then there are another 10% of people who are in there who are 55 years or older. Prisons are actually now operating assisted living centers. And those persons also are not going to commit dangerous acts. So again, we don't have to, you can tell your dad, we don't have to, lock out. And if people are thinking of the rapists and murderers, that's 5%. It's literally 5%. So we could start with that 40%. And again, use these brilliant minds and this amazing energy to imagine what to do with the other 60%.
But what I would also say, where'd the question asker go? Okay. What I would also say, and I love that you said bio and African American studies, right? Yeah, there you go. What I would also encourage you to do is to already imagine something beyond prison abolition, because power shifts. And what we already see, so when I'm saying that a young man already feels like he's locked on the block, the institutions, the technology of prisons are already operating within neighborhoods. Community corrections is an increasing population, and so we could not have prisons and not have prison walls and still have the same power relationship, right? The racialized relationship between black communities and the state and state violence as we do today. And so imagining, and that is in some ways even more progressive and radical than that, right? What does a truly just relationship, right, between black communities, talking about black communities, and the state look like? Right? And then what roles do these institutions play in encouraging that or discouraging that?
Real quick to that, I think I've also been kind of worried that in talking about prison abolition, I saw 13th when it came out, and oh, thank you. And I appreciated getting an understanding of the ways in which slavery was then incarnated into Jim Crow, and then now it's become mass incarceration. And so an end to prisons seems like just a kind of blank slate for something else to fill the space.
Well, that's how they ended it, if you recall. You got the ankle bracelets, which we all know that's one of the fastest selling elements of apparatus in the control and suppression industry.
So I think you're right, and I think part of how you respond to the crisis depends on what you think the crisis is. And so in my book, Chokehold, I think about different versions. So some people say the crisis is black men, right? So the answer is if we just pull up our pants and stop calling each other the N-word and stop, take care of our children, it'll be all good. Other people, and this is, I think, the main expression, they say it's about a relationship between the police and communities of color. And so then the answer is procedural justice. It's about repairing the relationship. And that's the frame of the Obama administration. That's the frame of mainstream civil rights organizations. But the third frame from the Movement for Black Lives is it's about white supremacy. It's about controlling communities of color. And the police are overseers, essentially. Their job is to enforce this racialized system. And if that's what you think, then having a good relationship is kind of incoherent. A master and a slave, or a slave and an overseer, they're not supposed to have a good relationship. So part of it is identifying what you see as the problem. But you're right. If it's the Black Lives Matters frame, if the problem is white supremacy, then to use our medical school analogy, if all you're working on is the police, you're treating the symptom. You're not treating the problem.
Okay, I want to throw a question out there because we've had a lot of conversation about the relationship between law enforcement on one hand and the black community on the other. But of course, the black community is not monolithic. And there are many different types of folks within the black community. When I think about this, I can't help but think about my own family, and in particular, my 90-year-old aunt who lives in Oakland, in the Oakland Hills, in fact, and for the last many years, she has been afraid, with justification, to walk down her street.
In the Oakland Hills?
In the Oakland Hills, on Crest Drive. And she can give you specific incidents that have led to her fear. And this is a woman who is, 90 years old, stylish dresser, she's energetic, she's in good health, and she wants to get exercise. But she feels she can't walk out her home because of the danger that she feels is lurking out there, and that is reflected in various incidents that have occurred. So that's one piece of my family. The other side of the family I'm thinking about is a younger family, my sister, sisters who live in Cleveland. And they worry when we go to visit them. Our oldest son recalls walking in the house and my sister telling him, well, you might not want to sit there. And he says, well, why not? She says, well, that's near the window. maybe you don't want to sit near the window. He's like, well, why can't I sit near the window? And the bullet holes that are in their house attest to why she doesn't want her nephew to sit near her window, right? So what do we tell those people? One in Oakland, 90 years old, one generation or two younger, inner city Cleveland. And these are not people who I would imagine, as with your father, these are not people who are going to immediately gravitate toward the idea of prison abolition, even though they've all known people who've been in prison.
Well, this is certainly something that is not news to me. And so as someone who's, obviously who's done work in neighborhoods like this and understands that first, that the violence is real, right? So as I said, the young men who were in this corpus, some of them are dead. 5 of the young men that I met during the course of my field research died, were killed, and certainly have the experience. I knew exactly what you're going to say about not sitting by the window as a consequence of the work that I've done in the neighborhood. And so there is no easy answer to this. But if policing were the thing to keep people safe in that way, it would have already done so. Because we've already shifted to this historic moment where the police are more deeply entrenched in neighborhoods than they ever were. So we moved from a period of abdication, right? You call the police, they never show up, right? And now they're everywhere and the violence continues. And so the question of that vulnerability to violence is a real one, but and I know it's not satisfying. I mean, I spoke to young people who have to negotiate this, as other people in the room have done. It's not a satisfying but a response. But to think that it's just going to be the police that are going to keep us safe, keep people in those communities safe. So I'm on the train down here from Oakland, and I look out, and like a dozen people have their iPhones out. They feel safe. There are people in this world who feel really safe. And then there are people in pockets, right, of cities who don't. And that's a history, that's an experience that's tied to a particular history. That is not a satisfying answer to or response to why can't I go outside, but it is in fact the response to why you can't go outside. And so I'll just this one short story that kind of encapsulates this. I live in Oakland, in between the hills and the flatlands. I'm hanging out downstairs one morning. I have a sliding door out into a backyard area. A young man runs through my backyard. And I'm like, what? And my backyard's as big as this like stage, okay? But he runs through and I'm like, what is going on here? And I look at him and I bang on the window and I said, what are you doing? And he says, shh, I'm running from the police. And I'm like, bro, we are not in this together. Right?
Thank you for being real on this point.
Right. But at the same time, in fact, we are in this together. Because what do I want to do in that moment? I'm feeling constrained because I don't feel like the police are going to make me any safer in that moment. Right?
I
and
would have
that's
wondered
the challenge.
why he's running from the police.
Well, yeah, you have to, but it could be a misdemeanor.
That's right, that's relevant. Yeah.
And then I'm going to call the police and like, this guy's going to get back in the system. Is that going to make him safer, right? Or did he do something? But other people don't have to make that calculation, right? That's an experience that's not equally distributed around the population, right? And that's a problem.
This is great, and let me just emphasize, I mean, these are, well, I'll just speak for myself. I don't have the answers, right? I think these are hard issues, and that's one of the reasons it's such a great thing to have this event, because these are hard issues, right? If they were easy issues, then there wouldn't be a need for this kind of event. But the hard issue here, though, I think, and I'm with Paul. This is why you're inspirational, to have the vision and the aspiration, and I think the vision of a society without crime, without violence, without police, without prisons, I'm all in on that, right? All in on that. But the question that my 90-year-old aunt will want an answer to is, so what happened? And she's not, frankly, she's 90, right? She's not looking at the long future. She wants to know, well, what's going to happen in the interim? Right? How are the next 5 years of her life going to be? When she goes, and she does, when she and her son, my cousin, when they go to the Oakland City, forums where they discuss these issues. They want to know, well, what are you going to do now, and how is that going to make our lives better? My strong sense from them is that, abolition of the police or criminal justice agencies, incarceration, that's not speaking to them. So do we have an answer that will speak to them?
I don't know if I have an answer to your grandmama.
No, this is my aunt. This is my aunt.
But what I can say is, if we are going to get to that vision, that the first thing, there are steps along the way that involve healing communities and rebuilding community connection and networks. And I came to this as a focus after having lived in Cuba for 6 months in 2002. I went there for my sabbatical. I was doing work on violence and youth violence, and went down there to see, well, what's going on with youth violence down here. Essentially what I found is, in terms of how we understand and experience youth violence, they didn't have it. Didn't exist. They have other problems, but they didn't have that. And I was like, okay, why? And what I found was that communities were remarkably intact, for some good reasons and some problematic reasons. I mean, that's one of the contradictions of Cuba, is you go there and you find out the things that are good are intricately tied to the things that you have a problem with. So, for example, people can't move. Therefore, their communities are very intact. Everybody knows each other. I'm in Santiago de Cuba. I'm in the outskirts. I decide I'm going to take a walk to the center of town to see some music. My wife's going to hang out with the family and watch the telenovela. And I'm like, okay, fine. I didn't miss a minute of the telenovela, because you walk all the way, all the windows are open, everybody's watching the same show, and everybody's like, oh yeah, kiss her, kiss her. I'm like, has he kissed her yet? No. But you get this feeling of community that's very, very strong. And then I worked with an organization that dealt with kids who had problems. Because I asked them, I said, well, what do you do with kids who have problems? And they said, well, come and take a look. And this organization, and it was run by 4 people. It was a physician, a musician, a psychologist, and a teacher. And they trained all of their school teachers in the elementary school in what they call diagnostics around problems, behavioral problems, attitude problems, family problems, psychological problems, all of it. And then when they identified, and we're talking about elementary school, when you identify a kid who has a problem, what do? You pull them into this program that's community-based, and I said, well, what do you do with the kids? They said, well, half the time we do music, and half the time they talk about their problems. I'm like, 5-year-old, 6-year-old kids? No, you don't. I said, come on. And I get in there, and they don't have the language to say, well, I have attention deficit disorder. But they're like, yeah, I come in and I have a hard time dealing with this and that, and they talk about it. But more importantly, what was really impressive was, in a 3-week period, I saw 40 people from that community just drop in to work in the community, in that center. So the point being is, in that community, figuring out how to reestablish those connections, those ties. Part of the lack of safety and the feeling of vulnerability is isolation. Being reconnected and having a sense of relationship, that makes a huge difference, makes you feel much safer than any police person on site could ever do. And so that's the first step, is figuring out how to reconnect her to her neighbors, to her community, and have them hear her sense of vulnerability and say, okay, we got this. We call us when you need something. Well, I mean, that's the kind of thing that needs to be rebuilt in communities that are highly impacted and folks don't want to come outside.
Yeah. Paul?
So this won't sound like a direct answer to your aunt, but it actually is. The average wealth, the average net worth of an unmarried white man is about $42,000. The average net worth of an unmarried African-American woman is $100. Of an unmarried Latina is $110. That's why your aunt has a problem with violence. People say, well, what about poor white people? They don't have the same involvement with the criminal justice system as low-income African Americans and Latinos. The reason why is there's no poor in the United States like black poor. You can't compare the experiences of low-income African Americans with the experiences of low-income people of other races, with the exception of Indians, actually, American Indians. Actually, poor black people have categorically different experiences. So if you have high poverty neighborhoods, 7 out of 8 people who live in high poverty neighborhoods are Latino or African American, and easy access to guns, that's a recipe for violence. And no matter what else you do, no matter how good the people in the community feel about themselves, no matter how much healing goes on, as long as you have those high poverty neighborhoods and easy access to guns, your aunt's going to have that problem. Black people don't commit crime because we're black, right? We commit it because and Latinos are 7 out of 8 people. And so until you get rid of the hood, and until you end the easy access to guns, your aunt is going to have that issue.
Okay, this is that's very similar to the answer that I was inclined to give her, but somehow I didn't think she was happy with that.
Don't underestimate her.
Okay, so we're out of time, and so we should cede the floor because we have a wonderful keynote speaker up next. Thank you all.
The preceding program is copyrighted by the Board of Trustees of the Leland Stanford Junior University. Please visit us at med.stanford.edu.